On October 7, 2023, a highly coordinated multi-pronged attack was initiated by the terrorist organization Hamas on behalf of Palestinians in Gaza against unarmed civilian Israeli citizens. The initial attack left over 1,400 men, women, and children slaughtered, some of them in their homes while they lie in bed. In some cases, the victims didn't even see who their killer was. Communities were sacked and burned. And there was no declaration of war, no assault against military installations, or even critical infrastructure sites. It was against families who were at home having a barbecue, at the park, or at a music festival. People who had no idea that this was going to be the last day of their lives. Now Israel has regrouped. Men and women of the Israeli Defense Force have been called to serve. The IDF has begun air, land, and sea assaults on Gaza in response to the initial and ongoing attacks by Hamas. And now, at the eve of the coup de grace by Israel, you're hearing cries from the international community, our leftist media, and even many Democrat politicians for a ceasefire. In this episode of Office of the Patriot, I'm going to discuss the reasons for all of the pleas for a ceasefire and how they are being used to further the vilification of Israelis and Jews all over the world. Hello, and welcome to the Office of the Patriot. In this office, I try to make sense out of the nonsense of the progressive left. If you are a subscriber, thank you for your continued viewership. It is appreciated. If you are a returning viewer, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future presentations. And if you are a first-time visitor to my channel, well, congratulations on finding it. It's usually hidden very well by the YouTube algorithm. However, I hope you find the content worth coming back for. My name is Myron Ybarra, and I'm your host. I remember as a kid getting into my first fight. I believe I was either in the 4th or 5th grade, and the fight was going to take place after school by the running track. And if I'm being completely honest, I was terrified, but it wasn't of getting hit or even getting hurt. It was of the repercussions I would face at home from my father. My father was a very stern disciplinarian. He told my brothers and I, don't you ever go looking for a fight, but once it starts, you don't run from it either. Whatever it takes, you finish it, and you make damn sure that you're the one standing at the end. That way, the person you were fighting will think twice about fighting you again. And at that time, I chalked it up to a lecture of a ranting old man. So let's move forward a couple of decades where I came across the book Ender's Game. The protagonist, Ender Wiggin, believed the same way my father did, which now makes absolute sense. If you haven't had the opportunity to read this book, I highly suggest you do. It is an amazing story. Towards the beginning of the book, Ender Wiggin got into a fight at school with a much larger kid. In that fight, he put that kid into the hospital, but unbeknownst to Ender, that kid died. Now, you might think that Ender Wiggin is a monster for killing a kid, but I completely understood Ender's motivation. You see, he fought with only one goal in mind. He never wanted to have that fight again. And I see the same thing happening in Israel's war against Hamas. War is nothing new to Israel, and in fact, it's nothing new to the Jewish community. The Jewish people just suffered a near extermination at the hands of Hitler less than 3 years prior to Israel becoming a Jewish state in 1948. And what do the Jews get immediately following their new statehood? 5 Middle Eastern nations immediately attack, and the attacks continue to this day. After each conflict, Israel comes to the table, proposes a ceasefire, and then ultimately agrees to peace in exchange for whatever the opposing side is asking for. And still it isn't enough. And I spoke to this in episode 67 where I stated that I believe this conflict and the ones prior are based on hate the Palestinians and much of the Arab world have towards Israelis, Jews, and Christians. And it stems from interpretations radical Islamic leaders obtain from the Quran and then pass on to the rest of the Muslim people. This is why the vast majority of Muslims who may not be terrorists don't openly oppose terrorism against Jews and Christians. This learned behavior has continued for over a century, And this type of hate and intolerance, it feels kind of weird using that word intolerance when it's been co-opted by the left so much, but in this case, it is appropriate. This type of intolerance isn't something that's going to be absolved or forgiven by allowing self-governance or giving land or anything else. You're probably wondering, how does this tie into the reason everyone is calling for a ceasefire, and how does it relate to nothing more than a way to vilify Israel? Well, it goes back to Israel's previous responses to attacks made against it. In all the previous attacks, Israel prevailed and yet went back to the table to try to barter for peace. Anybody with a functioning set of eyes can see that that's never worked. And I believe that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also come to this conclusion. As such, he's made it clear that he has no intention of committing to a ceasefire and is taking steps to start a boots-on-the-ground campaign into Gaza to find and destroy every Hamas stronghold within the region. And I can't say I blame him. After you've been kicked in the teeth more than a few times by promises of peace and coexistence, trusting your attackers is a pretty hard thing to do. The ceasefire, prior to dealing with a militant arm of radical Islam, Hamas and all the other Islamic terrorist groups, is for all intents and purposes an act of surrender. It tells all of the Arab nations that have a vested interest in seeing Israel fall that all they have to do is, after they attack and before Israel returns fire, run and hide and then call for a ceasefire to minimize losses. And in response, the world will scream for a ceasefire and Israel will be forced to comply. If Israel or any other country, to include the U.S., does this, it will ultimately spell the end for that country. But that's the goal for most Muslims and progressive liberals. All over the world, you're seeing protests calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Queers for Palestine, and that one cracks me up the most. It's much like cows, pigs, and chickens advocating for barbecue. Students at prestigious universities and millions of Muslim immigrants all over the world are letting their true feelings be seen and heard. Chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and stop the genocide are being used to drum up sympathy for Palestinians as a result of the war they brought upon themselves. This is just another psyop to convince the gullible that Israel and the U.S. don't want peace. If you'll believe it, there are some nations who not only believe that Israel is at fault for this entire attack, but that Hamas isn't even a terrorist organization. When these lies are fed into the liberal media machine, they're twisted and rearranged to garner sympathy and then spread to the masses via the newsfeed to convince millions of gullible people that good is bad and evil is righteous indignation. When the media spins the facts to make Hamas and Palestinians the victims of subjugation by Israeli rule, the lemmings eat up this drivel and disregard the evil perpetrated by Hamas based on a false moral equivalence. You subjugate us, we kill your children. That's fair. Any rational and moral human being, that's nowhere near a proportional response, even if the Palestinians were right. But they're not. Many of these protesters have been convinced that it's okay that Hamas slaughtered innocent Israeli civilians because Israel is guilty of being oppressors. And that makes about as much sense as this meme. Right now, Israel needs to stay the course and exterminate Hamas. Many people would believe that the hard part for Israel is already past. The death of 1,400 innocent civilians, the basis of that belief. But I don't believe it is. Israel has a very long road ahead of it, and the only way I see a chance for peace in this region is to take a page from the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Reagan believed in the concept of peace through strength, and during the Republican National Convention on July 17, 1980, Ronald Reagan addressed the nation. We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they're weak. It's then that tyrants are tempted. This concludes today's presentation of Office of the Patriot. If you enjoyed the content, please take the time to like, subscribe, and share my channel on your social media. It is appreciated. And as always, have a blessed day and stay safe out there.